to this virtual forage here at a very windy beaver forest park. We're going to take a walk through the park and try and identify a whole selection of edible things that you can find here that are also really common in lots of the parks in Belfast and in Northern Ireland in general. Just a few things to remember. If this is your first time going out foraging, there's a few kind of basic guidelines to follow. So one, be sensible about where you pick. This is a frequent user of dogs at Beaver Park, so kind of pick away from the kind of main paths just so you get something that's a little bit cleaner. Also make sure you always wash everything before you eat it too. Also be sensible about what you're picking too, so pick sustainably, don't take too much, take only what you need. 3, uprooting plants is illegal, so you only want to collect from the trees. So we're talking about leaves, we're talking about flowers, we're talking about foliage. Do not be tempted to remove a plant from the ground. That's actually against the law, and we don't really want to do that anyway because it'll kill the plant. And then lastly, and the number one rule is be 100% sure about what you're picking before you eat it, which seems really, really basic. It is the number one kind of foraging rule, but it is really important because there are some dangerous and some poisonous plants that you need to be aware of that grow really frequently here. So make sure you do your research and then just enjoy yourself. A lot of the things we're talking about today will be really, really basic and really, really easy to identify. So hopefully you can use this video to come and do some of your own foraging really soon. This might be a tree you might already be familiar with if you spend a bit of time outside in Northern Ireland. This is birch. And birch is a tree I actually already knew before I started learning how to forage because it's so distinctive. So this beautiful kind of peel bark with these ridges, you'll see these little papery little bits of the bark coming away. These kind of large kind of cracks and marks in it, it's pretty distinctive. That peel bark as well is really easy to spot in a kind of forest of trees like we're in now. So birch, yes, I was always familiar with. But one thing I didn't do until a few years ago was learn how to tap birch sap, which is what I'm going to show you how to do now. So I actually learned this from a friend of mine, Lucy O'Hagan, who is Wild Awake Ireland on social media, and she is amazing and a genius and has incredible knowledge about plants and trees and the tradition of use in Ireland and things like that. So I learned from her, learning from the best. So tapping a birch tree is really, really simple. You may have seen this already on kind of social media, or you might have read about it if you haven't tried it before. And it usually involves kind of drilling into the tree and using a tap, similar to the process of extracting maple syrup. And so if you're kind of a big scale maple syrup collector, you'll see people will attach pipes and things like that along the way and kind of drain the sap from them. We're going to do a much more simple kind of everyday process that we can do just to collect a little bit for ourselves, which is a bit kinder to the tree. So a little bit about the sap. So the sap is really like the life force of the tree, and in the winter time, obviously deciduous trees like birch lose their leaves and their kind of energy goes into their roots. And then when spring is kind of starting to arrive, like now, that energy, that life force, the sap, comes back up through the tree and makes its way up to all the branches, and that will start the production of leaves and will continue the life of the birch. So there is a little bit of time. It's a very, very small window to collect birch sap. It's only a matter of weeks. And I have been really unlucky and have never and have often missed out on the birch sap, but we have collected a little bit of it this season. It might be too late by the time you see this video to collect some for yourself, but this might be helpful for next year. So let's go through the process. So this is really simple. Just take a little branch, and it's sometimes tricky to find a birch tree with an appropriate branch. Here at Beaver we had to spend quite a bit of time looking for one that was good, but this is ideal. So this little flexible branch, you can go a little bit thicker in this, and you want a good established and healthy looking tree as well. So select your branch, and then kind of select a spot that's kind of allows for extra growth. So even on here or here is ideal, and then you want to cut it. And you should see, if you've picked at the right time, you should see immediately that there's some kind of liquid forming there, which there is. Hopefully you can see that on the camera. There's a little bit of the sap that's coming through. So you'll see it's quite like water, and in fact it is water-like in flavour. This only contains like 1% sugar, but that's what we're looking for in this in order to get our kind of birch syrup, or to use this in a recipe or put it into a wine and things like that. So once you've cut it and you're confident that there's sap coming from, which we can see there is some there, you want to just get something simple. Like I've just got a jar here, so and I don't know if you can see there, but I've cut a hole in the top of the jar and I've got an elastic band. So I'll just take the elastic band, wrap this around my branch a couple of times, and then the weight of the jar will help pull this down, and then wrap my elastic band round. So just really simple. So we're going to leave that on there. It can take a long time, especially using this method, because it's quite, like say, quite gentle. It'll take a long time for this jar to fill up. So usually I'll leave this on and leave it on for quite a few hours or even overnight and come back to it. So we're going to leave that there now, and we'll see what we can collect then, and I'll show you at the end. So we're going to look next at one of our most common trees that you'll find here in Belfast. These are absolutely all over the park, all over the forest. This is hemlock. Now that's a very confusing name for a forager, because hemlock is best known as a poisonous plant. It's actually a completely different species. They are in no relation whatsoever. I believe that the name hemlock given to the tree comes from the smell that hemlock has. So it has this kind of like slightly fresh, like herbal sweet smell that hemlock has. I've never smelt poison hemlock, so I couldn't tell you if that is the case. But you don't need to worry about it, hemlock for this name. It's just the common name for this tree. So these are a really useful tree to know, because these make excellent tea. So there's quite a few trees that are useful for making tea, but it is really important to be aware of the danger of yew. So yew is also one of our super common trees, and it's worth keeping in mind because it is incredibly dangerous. It's very poisonous, and you certainly do not want to eat it. But there's a few ways you can keep yourself right. So if you want to collect the likes of hemlock, or collect larch, or Scots pine, those are all suitable for making tea and collected to eat, are totally edible. One way is to look for cones. So yew do not produce cones, they actually produce berries, and you might even be familiar with yew berries, and quite confusingly, yew berries are edible. Just the seed is not edible, and none of the rest of the parts of the tree are edible, but the berries are. So hemlock here, western hemlock I think this is, have cones. So the cones are really small, you might not be able to see it from there, but I'll show you some close-ups in a moment. So little tiny cones that are attached to the branches at different stages, and they tend to be around for most of the year as well, so that's kind of a helpful tip when collecting this. What's distinctive about western hemlock and why it's a useful one to know is because of its needle attachment. So there are lots and lots of different sizes along the branches here, and they almost have like a furry appearance, and from a distance you'll be able to spot that as well. So they almost look soft, and actually they do feel kind of soft as well, say in comparison to something like a Douglas fir or something like that, which has really pointy needles. The smell is really distinctive. So we talked about the smell in comparison with hemlock plant. So a good way to know if you've got a pine or spruce or fir that you want to collect for tea, yew tends to have no smell. I mean, you might pick up like a green smell from it, but it won't have that kind of piney smell that I feel like a lot of us are familiar with. So western hemlock to me smells really amazing. Like it almost has a lime zest kind of smell, like really fresh, bright. piney, you know, like Christmas tree, that Christmas tree smell that we all know. So if you've picked out all those attributes, you can be pretty confident that you found hemlock. So how to use this? I already talked about tea, and that is my favourite way to use pine needles or spruce needles or hemlock needles, is in a tea. So you can pick these and just use them fresh, and just take the needles, give them a wee chop to kind of get out more of those flavours and those kind of aromas, and then steep them for as long as you can. So even sometimes like cooking up a little bit of these needles as well to extract plenty of flavour from them. It's just so incredibly delicious, lovely fresh flavour. These pines and things like that as well tend to have like really high levels of vitamin C and stuff like that, so really useful to use as well, especially at this time of year. These are all over beaver, yeah, I do encourage you to go out and try them, and this one's a really useful and easy one to identify. The next plant that we're going to talk about is this one that's growing here on the forest floor. This is wood sorrel. So this one is really easy to identify. It's one that we'll all be familiar with because of the shamrock, which is the national symbol, a national plant of Ireland, but very confusingly does not have an actual plant connected to it. Shamrock is considered lots of different plants, but a lot of people think that this is probably what the shamrock was, the wood sorrel. So these three heart-shaped leaves connected in the middle. So like I say, it likes to grow in this environment, and you'll find it all over beaver. Wherever there's kind of a little bit of soil growing underneath a load of trees, you'll find these growing in large patches, and they're at their very, very best now. So wood sorrel, it gets its name, it's actually the name of the family is oxalis, and there's lots of cultivated oxalis plants, so you might even have one in your home, and it actually gets its name from its flavour. So we talked about hemlock having a common name from being the smell of poison hemlock. This gets its name from having the flavour of common sorrel, which we're going to cover later in the video. Common sorrel has a sour flavour, like a sour fresh flavour, and that's exactly the flavour that wood sorrel has as well. So it actually isn't in the sorrel family at all. It's just managed to get that common name from the flavour. So beautiful, sour, fresh flavour. This one amazingly was massively favoured by chefs, and I'm sure it still is, in the last few years for that kind of bright flavour, and I saw this pop up on menus everywhere, and it's kind of amazing because this one is just so common here, and it's really easy to kind of think of common weeds as not having huge amount of value. Wood sorrel is not like that. It is so delicious, so common, so easy to collect as well, so you can come here and pick lots and lots of it, and really easily. You want to go for leaves that are quite young and feel like fresh and new. Do be aware of dogs as well in places like this, so if you're picking wood sorrel, I do recommend that you take it home and give it a good wash before you eat it, because of where it likes to grow. But once you do, it's really enjoyable. So wood sorrel is best eaten just raw as it is, so it's an amazing salad green and will really add like a lemony lift to any salads that you make. So just gather a load of this, mix it in with something else, and adds so much flavour. We have a fungi species for you now, and I didn't expect to find any of these today because it's kind of the end of the season for this mushroom, but a really nice find and a really amazing mushroom for a beginner, because this one is so distinctive. So you might have spotted this one already and wondered what it was. So this is, the common name is scarlet elf cap for this mushroom, and you can see how it's got its name, this beautiful scarlet red colour, really beautiful, and elf cap or elf cup, so this kind of cup shape. These are sometimes also known as fairy baths, which I think is super cute because of this kind of cup shape as well. So very often people think that red means danger, and that is the case for some plants and certainly the case for lots of mushrooms. But in this case, it is not true. This one is actually edible, and it's actually edible raw. If you can find one that's nice and clean and young, you can eat it just as it is. So this one is a really useful one to know because of that. So super safe. Has this beautiful cup shape, and you can see they can grow quite big, but this is more typical. So beautiful wet red in the inside, and then pale red or pale pink or even white on the outside here as well. So it likes to grow on dead wood. It is a wood rotter, wood eater mushroom. So a lot of mushrooms, that is their function. They reduce the waste in the forest by eating away at dead wood and dead trees, and that's where they get all their nutrients from. So look for dead wood in the winter. You'll likely find some scarlet elf caps, and this one is incredibly common, but it's funny, it's one I didn't notice until I learned what it was a few years ago, and now I find them absolutely everywhere. So one worth looking out for. You can eat them like say raw. They will cook up. They have a surprisingly mushroomy flavour. They're definitely not up there with the kind of choice gourmet wild mushrooms, but certainly they do have a good mushroomy flavour, and they also dry really nicely too. And I've dried these and kind of powdered them and got a beautiful like brick red coloured powder for adding to things as well, so worth experimenting with. Also just really beautiful to find as well. Absolutely, definitely up there with my favourite mushrooms. Just going to take a moment to cover some of our bulk greens that you'll find not only at Beaver but also in any kind of park, maybe even in your garden as well. I certainly find this one in my garden. This is cleavers, or sticky weed, or sticky willy it's called, or has 100 names. Goosegrass is a good one as well. I've been told actually that geese don't like this, so I don't know why that has that name, but there you go. And that sometimes happens with common names. They end up kind of collecting, and people get them passed down from their granny and things like that. So this one is probably best known for having those little hooks that attach to your clothes. So you've probably walked through a forest and had this attached around your ankles. But this is an edible plant, and this is a really good one to know for now, because this is when it's at its best. So when it's quite young, even smaller than this, even finer, I'll use this as a herb. So you might think, oh, but those have got little hooks, how do you eat that? When you chop this up or give it a good crush, those little hooks will break up, and it makes it possible to eat. So I'll throw this into like salsas, and I'll throw this into pestos. I'll even like cook it up in a stir fry. It is actually surprisingly delicious. A lot of wild greens we think of are bitter. So if you think of dandelion or dock, those have kind of a bitter flavour. And while I do enjoy eating dandelion as well, this one has no bitterness. It actually has a little bit of sweetness to it, so I find this is a really useful one to know. A really simple way to enjoy cleavers is actually in a water. So pick this, give it a wee crush, and put it into a glass of water or a bottle of water, the same way you would use mint or lime, and it imparts a lovely, beautiful, fresh flavour. Like even if I smell this now, you get just the most bright herbal cucumbery smell from cleavers, and that's a really simple way to kind of enjoy it. Second one I want to talk about really briefly again is nettles, and I feel like most people know the nettles are edible, but I want to point them out because this is the best time to use them by far as a green. So nettles obviously have a sting, so be careful when you're picking. I recommend using gloves. And when you're picking as well, I try to just go for these top set of leaves. One, because they're usually more tender, more delicious, more nutritious as well, but also when you cut it here, it means that more growth can come back from the other stems. So I cut this from the top, and then the other stems will produce new nettle leaves on top. as well. So how to use nettles, simplest way is to treat it as you would spinach. So throw this into soup, throw this into, people put these into smoothies. It's actually okay to eat a little bit of nettle raw, but just like our cleavers, just make sure you crush them or chop them up before you do that, otherwise you will get stung, and you do not want to get stung in your mouth. I have had it happen to me before and it's pretty unpleasant. Better yet is just to cook it. So as soon as you put these into a pot with a little bit of heat, the sting will disappear. So you can use these really simply. They work amazingly well in a curry. You can also fry these. Nettles will actually crisp up really nicely. So yeah, really big host of things that you can play with when using them, and definitely early spring, best time to go out and pick lots of them and include them in your food. So when you're out doing your forage of beaver, especially we're at the end of March now, in the next few weeks you might be walking around and seeing lots of these on the ground and wondering what they are, because they're absolutely everywhere. These are the young shoots of Himalayan balsam. So Himalayan balsam is a real problem in beaver and in Lagan Meadows and in lots of the parks actually in Belfast. This is a highly invasive plant and it completely takes over. The plant has an incredible way of surviving. It does very well in our climate, and it spreads lots and lots of seeds in the summertime, which is how it gets everywhere. So like I said, it's a real problem in beaver, and it is pretty much on every path you will take, you'll see this growing. So this is actually an edible plant. And later in the season I actually collect this for its flowers and for its seed pods, and that's a really good thing to do because it means you're kind of controlling the population of Himalayan balsam. But even better is to kind of pick it and destroy it now. So I talked about uprooting at the start of the video, and uprooting being against the law, but this is an exception. Feel free to uproot these little Himalayan balsam shoots as you go along. It is possible to eat these as well. You'll very often find them where the dogs go, so just be aware of that when you're picking them. And also sometimes they taste a little bit muddy, so they're not my favourite. But it is possible to eat these. Much better to eat the flowers and the seeds later, they're much more delicious. But do feel free to pick these, break them up. So usually I'll kind of give them a crush and then I'll dump them on the path, and sometimes I'll even stamp on them as well to get rid of them, because they are such a problematic plant here and they just take over. And why that's a problem is because it will cover up the light for all other kinds of plants, and will kind of take over an area, especially near waterways and things like that too. So yeah, Himalayan balsam, edible but invasive, so good to get rid of it. We talked about using hemlock and pine needles for tea. We're going to talk about beech. So there's lots of useful tree leaves out there, edible tree leaves, and I use a lot of them for tea through the year. And one that's really helpful to know in this early stage, so we're still kind of early spring, is beech leaves, because they tend to be hanging around for a little while, especially on these kind of juvenile, this kind of young beech tree. So identifying beech is really easy in the early spring compared to some other trees, in my opinion. So they have these beautiful kind of points of where the new growth is coming through, and you'll find that growing right at the end of all the branches. So these little points, I always think they kind of look like, you know, pointy fingernails or something like that, so really easy to pick those out. And then especially, like say, on these kind of juvenile or even on hedges as well, they tend to hold on to their leaves too. And these are the leaves that I'm going to include in the tea in your little pack. So these don't have a ton of flavour at this stage. In the early spring, I love to collect beech leaves actually and eat them raw. So there is a small period of time when they're just fresh out and they're beautiful and translucent, that they're really nice to eat. So they're soft and they're tender and they have a lovely citrusy flavour. At this stage they're obviously way too papery to eat. Obviously it doesn't seem overly appealing, but they do work well for tea. So they add a little bit of tannin to the tea, which is quite useful because that's a nice kind of thing to balance in something like a sweet tea or like a herbal tea to add a little bit of tannin in, and you do get like a hint of that kind of acidity from the leaves as well. Really useful to know because there's not too much around this time of year in terms of tree leaves, and these ones will almost always be here. So this beautiful gold leaf colour. They're super dry already as well, which means that's really helpful because you can just go and pick them and stick them in a jar, and then you've got tea for the rest of the season. And what's quite nice as well is to collect this type of leaf and use it as a starting point. So use beech leaf, and then you can add in like mint, or you can add some the hemlock, you can add in some other tree leaves like the hawthorn's wonderful. You can use oak leaves. You can add in just some of your own homegrown herbs as well, or even just a slice of lemon, and you've got your own kind of tea blend as well. So really useful, really delicious. So we talked about wood sorrel already. This is common sorrel, and common sorrel because it is incredibly common, but there are a few other rumex species that you might come across that are called sorrel as well. So one of them is sheep sorrel, but you're more likely to find common sorrel, and you're definitely going to find plenty of this if you come foraging at Beaver. So it prefers to be in a kind of meadowland. You'll find it growing kind of on the edges of woodlands and stuff like that, but usually if you find a bit of kind of open space, you'll usually find this growing. So this is in the same family as dock, and you might mistake it for dock if you're not familiar with sorrel. It has that kind of similar kind of long leaf shape, grows in a rosette just like dock as well, and also has these kind of, you know, these kind of rusty kind of burn marks on it as well. But it is not as kind of, I guess, crinkly, and it is a little bit more succulent feeling as well than kind of curl dock or common dock or broadleaf dock, which is the one we use, you know, to rub on our nettle stings. So this kind of simple leaf shape is kind of a defining feature for sorrel, but also these little tails. So all sorrel leaves will have these little set of two kind of pointy ends at the bottom of the leaves. So that's a good way to identify it as well. But there are a few other plants that will have these kind of tails on them as well. One of them to be aware of is arum. So we're going to talk about arum next. But we'll talk about sorrel and its flavour. So sorrel is actually one of my favourites, and I would try and usually pick it younger than this because I like to eat it raw and in a salad. But you can pick it at this stage and kind of chop it up and throw it into things as well. Where we talked about its kind of sour, bright sour flavour. So this has a flavour that's kind of lemony and zingy. In fact, a lot of people find it a bit too overpowering, and if you do, then I recommend, you know, mixing it with other things. But I absolutely love that kind of tangy sour flavour. It's not something you find commonly in wild plants here. So whenever I pick sorrel, I'm always delighted because it's a lovely additional flavour profile. And really, really common, really delicious, and really undervalued, I think, as well. So hopefully you'll be able to come out and find some here in Beaver Park yourself. The next thing we're going to talk about is this, and we're surrounded by it here. This is wild garlic. So this is by far the thing I get asked about most in the springtime, and there's a reason why. It's just so delicious. Luckily in Beaver Park there is quite a lot of it here, and there's lots of little scattered patches around the place. So I'll send you some little drop pins on a Google map to show you where to find this if you come here and you're not sure, because there's a few other things to be aware of when you're collecting. So a few rules about collecting wild garlic specifically, because it is so kind of enamoured and people really want to collect it and enjoy it and make pesto and put it on their pizza and put it on their bread and things like that. So lots of people want to collect wild garlic, but it's important to be sustainable. So always come and pick with a plan, and I try and do that with all the foraging that I do. It's really important to keep that in mind. You want to make sure that you're not taking too much and that you're not destroying the population. So we already talked about not uprooting. when you're coming to pick wild garlic, it's the leaves that you want. Those are the prize. Don't think in your mind it's garlic root. This is a totally different plant, and actually when you cut wild garlic, it will keep on living there, so it means that you maintain the species there. So just come and take the leaves. It takes a long time for wild garlic to establish, even though there's a lovely big patch here. It'll take many years for this to expand, so do come and just take what you need. Two, it's really important as well to pick leaf by leaf. So the reason for doing that is because there are lots of plants that you need to look out for. So if you come picking with a plan and you pick leaf by leaf, for your pesto and things like that, or you know, if you want to add these to soup or anything like that, it doesn't take too long to actually pick as much as you need. You know, a bunch this kind of size is plenty for soup or pesto or any other kind of recipe. So pick leaf by leaf, and a couple of plants you need to look out for are things like daffodils, or even bluebells are growing in among them, and those are toxic, you don't eat those. But also arum, which I already mentioned previously in the context of sorrel. So I've got a few arum leaves here, and if I show you, this is the young arum leaf. So if I held these up together, this is our wild garlic, this is our arum. If this was growing really close to it, you could quite easily mistake this for wild garlic, and you definitely don't want to eat arum. Although it's not poisonous, as in, you know, it won't poison you, it will give you a really horrendous burn in your mouth and in your throat. I've been told it's almost like pins and needles, so you definitely don't want to mix this up. And so this is a young arum leaf. You also maybe confuse that for sorrel too, so do pay attention. So this is the older arum leaf, and we talked already about those kind of little kind of feet there. But this one is much broader, much more arrow shaped. And there's also a kind of a vein that runs the entire length of arum as well. So if you're picking wild garlic or if you're picking sorrel, do look out for this kind of vein that runs the outside of it. And then you can keep yourself right, because you certainly don't want to eat either of these plants here. So back to our wild garlic. So how do you use it? Like I already talked at length about pesto. Pesto is a brilliant one, and it's a really delicious way to eat it. But it's also a really useful herb, so pop it into, you know, any kind of like any kind of sauce. Pop it into any kind of green-based dish. It's amazing, just like chopped up and sprinkled over things as well. So put it in your pasta dough, put it in your pizza dough. You know, ferment it. It makes the most incredible fermented product. And if you want to hear anything more about how to use wild garlic, we can talk about it at the end of the video as well. So yeah, get out and pick your wild garlic. Super delicious. This is the best time to collect it, but it does have a window right up until June. But now it's at its best when it's lovely and young and tender. So the next plant I'm going to talk about here is one to be really wary of, because it's in lots of places. That's it in the distance there as well. This is giant hogweed. So giant hogweed in its kind of early stage. This is a young plant, but even if I show you my shoe here, you can see how enormous it is. Giant hogweed is a dangerous plant. Its hairs and its sap have a toxin in it that will give you really bad burns if your skin is exposed to the sun. So I'm not even going to touch this. It's actually very dangerous too, and it's one to be aware of in Beaver Park because there is a lot of it here. It's another invasive species, just like our Himalayan balsam. It was brought over in kind of Victorian times when people wanted these kind of statuesque plants. And actually, if you see this in its full kind of glory, it actually is a really magnificent, really architectural plant, like really kind of amazing to look at, but definitely one to avoid. So the reason why I point this out is because I've seen this growing a lot among the wild garlic here at the moment. So do be aware of it, but there's a few ways you can avoid giant hogweed by identifying it. So you can see here it's got very, very shiny leaves, like almost waxy looking, And if I bring my camera right down, you should be able to see how hairy those young stalks are. So super hairy and also marked. So I'm going to bring my camera in really carefully. Can you see those little spots on there? That's a really good sign that you've definitely found giant hogweed. So I'm particularly interested in giant hogweed and being sure about what I'm picking, because I like to pick common hogweed, and at a glance, especially at this early stage, you might mix them up. So common hogweed is actually very delicious. They're both in the same family, they're kind of distant cousins, and like I say, at a young stage you might mistake common hogweed for giant hogweed or the other way around. So do be aware of it if you're interested in collecting common hogweed, but just be aware of it in general, especially if you're coming past here and you're wearing shorts and things like that. Just be aware of where you're walking, because it is absolutely everywhere here. So there's a little patch of it there as well. Just like absolutely everywhere in Beaver Park. They're trying to get rid of it, but I know it's an ongoing battle, so the best thing to do is to try and avoid it yourself. If you are out and about and you spot some giant hogweed, good thing to do is to report it. So there was lots of it actually growing along the Annadale embankment last year, that a friend of mine had sent me pictures of, and they actually managed to get rid of it there. So the council came out and took it away, because it is quite dangerous. You definitely don't want to get one of the burns from this. I've seen pictures of it and it's pretty horrific. So yeah, be aware of giant hogweed at Beaver Park. So it's been a couple of hours, not very long, in order to catch a lot of birch sap, but you can see it just there. So beautiful clear liquid, will taste slightly sweet, slightly woody, really something just like a little treat to have on the trail. But a lot of people do collect this and boil it down to syrup itself, and you can use that in place of anywhere you'd use maple syrup or sugar. So yeah, a fun like little experiment that you can do. Like I say, there might be a little bit of time left now in the season, but definitely for next year.